I guess we'll record. No, not usually on video, so you'll have to forgive me. Awkward on video. So welcome everybody to today's workshop. As you can see, this is on organizing your research and data management. My name is Jeremy Kenyon. I'm a research librarian here at the university. I'm a liaison to the College of Natural Resources. And for about 7 or 8 years, I worked as a data steward with the USGS program, doing data management, basically, working with researchers, predominantly in the area of environmental science and some sociocultural studies associated with climate change, helping them manage data. So we're going to talk a little bit about some of the sort of thoughts and strategies that you want to think about in the context of managing data. We're going to talk kind of broadly about coming up with kind of a model for how you might think about doing data management, both for yourself in the context of any project you're working on. Maybe you're all working on theses and dissertations at various levels. Maybe you're part of teams, you're part of labs. And so ideally, this kind of way of thinking is going to be relevant to all of those kinds of things. We'll get into some nitty-gritty kind of issues about file naming and things like that. But I would encourage everybody to ask questions. If you are not hearing something that you're really interested in, speak up, let me know. And hopefully we can kind of address that as best we can. Sound good? Okay. Are you guys excited? As excited as you can be for data management? Yeah. Let's see if this works here. So I'm gonna talk a little bit as to the whys of data management to start with. I think understanding exactly what we're trying to achieve by coming up with an organizational system, a way of thinking about kind of the flow and the movement of the documents, the material of a research project, is a big part of kind of understanding what would work for you. Got the chat there?
No.
Oh, okay. We'll let it go. We're going to talk specifically about dealing with files and systems and how to kind of enable kind of efficient and thoughtful ways to deal with that. I'm going to talk broadly about data management planning. We're not going to talk so much about, you may have heard of data management plans in the context of grants. The logic that we're going to discuss works for a data management plan itself, but there's so many agencies and they have their own requirements and specifics that that's a whole different workshop in itself. Then we're going to talk about just dealing with notes and kind of if you're doing a lot of reading and you're organizing all this stuff that you're collecting, how do you handle all that? So there's some tools and some tips for dealing with that. So hopefully, this has something for everybody. I'm hoping. So typically when we talk about data management, we've all got our kind of ways of working with files, right? All of us know how to use computers. We have files and folders and all this kind of stuff. But when we talk about doing this either efficiently for a specific research project or even more if you're doing this for a group of people of which you're a part of a team or something like that, you run into all of these kinds of problems. So you run into problems of memory. Certainly, you don't necessarily remember everything that happens in a project. You're certainly not going to remember it 3 years out. And we certainly don't have distributed memory capabilities. So we don't know what our team members know unless they document those things. So good data management helps us kind of solve these memory problems. And often many of your professors will say, well, I had a graduate student and they did all this work for us and then they left. And now I don't know anything that they did. I don't know where their data is. So what we can do is kind of mitigate that problem a little bit for them as well, which is a nice thing to do. We've got problems of time. So efficiency is always an issue. We don't want to go back and redo something we already did. We don't want to go back and fix data that we should have fixed the first time around when we collected it. And so we want to come up with a system that prevents us from having to basically waste a lot of time trying to figure out how to do things best. We want to do it best from the beginning. And then scaling problems are real issues as well. So we all have our idiosyncratic ways of collecting and managing things that work for us. It makes sense for us in our lifestyle, the way we do things. But does that work for a group of people? Does that work for a team? You may not want to do it your way. You may not want to do it their way. So can we come up with a model that enables us to do that kind of across the board? That's kind of the question. Do people run into these problems usually in their work? Do you run into problems of memory or of scaling or anything like that? Yeah? Okay. You guys can talk. It's okay. Be human. We'll all be human together. So I just wanted to kind of illustrate this a little bit better. If you're interested at all in the idea of data management or metadata, and there's going to be a workshop on metadata later this semester. There's a guy named William Mishner that you should take a look at some of his work. He's done a lot of really interesting stuff, but one of his kind of key articles sort of details this idea that over time, details about what happened in a project tend to get lost. So we begin losing track of. You might think to yourself, you know, I'm spending a lot of time on this. There's no way I'm ever going to forget it. There's so many other things that are going to happen in your life. You're going to forget some of this stuff, right? And then, of course, you know, accidents and other kinds of things. We lose our computers, hard drives fail, all these other kinds of things happen. So we're going to end up losing details about things. We need to solve those kinds of issues. There have been lots of studies and discussions in the world of data science about how much time people actually spend preparing and cleaning data as opposed to doing the fun stuff where they can analyze it or actually, you know, come up with some insights based on what they've been looking at. And so it's important to remember that we just, if we're not being thoughtful and careful about how we manage data, we end up just giving up a huge amount of time just to the preparation process. Some of this is inevitable. You're going to have to do some of it, but you can mitigate how much you actually have to deal with if you're thoughtful about it. And as I mentioned before, you know, we don't think about scaling very well, but we have a tendency to create these like data swamps rather than data lakes of our research data and documents. Does anybody have a folder on their computer where they've stuffed a bunch of stuff? They haven't really thought too much about what goes in there? Yeah.
It's called the random folders.
It's called the random folder. I have that too, yeah. Or it's like the kitchen drawer at home where you stuff all the random stuff in. Yeah, and so kind of this is a problem, especially if you're working with a group of people. You don't want to just keep stuffing things into the folder. You need organization for it. You need a system of documentation. You need rules governing how things are done. And it's good practice to do this for ourselves in the course of our own projects. And then that has returns and benefits when we start working with other people. So we really need to come up with a system. And so that's kind of what I'm going to try to focus on a little bit for the first part of today. I'm going to walk through kind of a model here, and then I actually want you guys to spend a little bit of time working on that model for your own cases and thinking about how it might apply to the projects that you're working on or data that you're dealing with in your own life. And let's talk a little bit about how that looks. So it's a fairly simple place to start. And one of the reasons why I've selected this one is it's actually based on a couple of well-known models in my world. So you're actually sitting in a giant version of this right now. A library is a place where we collect information, we store and we process it, we describe it, we manage it, and then people come in and they use that information, they apply it, and they write books, and they write papers, and they do all this kind of stuff. There's a model called the OAIS model, which is an ISO standard, if you're familiar with standards, that looks exactly like this. And if you go over to IBM and you say, what's the best way to manage enterprise data across a giant company? They'll give you something that looks like this as well. So this is a model that scales both from an individual all the way up to, you know, one of the biggest companies in the world. So it's really simple, right? Over here we start and we focus on what kinds of data that we're collecting. So all the stuff that we're producing, and I'll show you an example here in a second, and kind of what formats it's in, what structures it's in. Kind of get your head around all the inputs into your management system. Then we're going to think a little bit about where we're going to put it. So we're going to put these in a secure place. There's rules and issues. We're thinking about storage. We'll talk about that in a second. We're going to come up with those rules, and we're going to come up with ways of describing and documenting all the data that's coming in and what's happening. Then we're going to go back here. We're going to process that data, and so we'll have derivative data sets, analyzed data sets, lots of things that are produced. And then finally, we get to the cool stuff, which is papers, presentations, all that kind of stuff. So the idea is we've got this flow, we've got a governance model for this, and we've got a means to get it out. Does that kind of make sense to everybody? Okay. So I'm going to imagine a project right now. We'll say, come on. We'll say that I'm going to study workshops at the University of Idaho. So this is, you know, I'm gonna grab a bunch of data. I'm gonna read some literature, and I'm gonna write an article about workshops at the university. I'm gonna collect maybe attendance numbers. So how many people showed up today? I'm gonna collect surveys. So what did people think? So we've got kind of a paper form that people fill out. Maybe I think to myself, well, let's put this in the context of, you know, how many people are at the university and which programs. So I need to collect enrollment numbers. I'm going to have to go out and look at some literature. So every dissertation and thesis needs a literature review. Most articles are no different. I'm going to take notes on that literature as I think through it. And then I'm going to crunch those numbers. I'm going to use R to do that. So sounds like a pretty basic kind of structure for a project, right? I'm going to collect some data. I'm going to read some literature. I'm going to analyze some information. Pretty simple. And so I'm keeping track of what exactly the structures of these might be. So these are probably spreadsheets. This one is a paper form. Maybe I can convert it into a spreadsheet. Maybe I'll make a bunch of PDF documents, something. I'm going to use a citation manager for my references. And I'll talk about why that is in a second, but that's kind of an easy way of keeping track of that. Your note-taking procedure may vary. Mine's typically to use OneNote as a relatively easy tool for keeping track of that. And then I'm going to do my work in R, so I'm going to keep track of my code using a code repository. So I know what I'm going to work with. I know what I'm collecting. I have an idea about their structures. I know kind of what's happening. And then I'm going to think about where I'm going to put things. And so all of us know that there are so many different options for cloud storage and, you know, all the different places you can put things. You can put them on USB drives and external hard drives. You can do all sorts of things. My general rule of thumb here is you want the minimum number of places with the maximum available use. So I want to put files all in one place that I can. I put references in Zotero because Zotero has all sorts of special functions that will help me when I'm actually writing my paper to work with the database. So I actually want that in a separate place. And code repositories are particularly useful for people that work with a lot of code for all the different features that they have. So I kind of want to take advantage of those as well. So if all I'm doing is managing files, I want to put it in OneDrive, for example. Maybe that's Dropbox, maybe that's Google Drive, something like that. And I'm thinking about these other kinds of options for these other types of things. So everything is in hopefully the minimum number of places possible. Does that all kind of make sense? Okay. Then we're going to start thinking a little bit about governance. So to actually keep track of what I've got, to keep it from becoming a data swamp, because, you know, we're sticking everything together in the one folder, as I said we shouldn't do, but we can do it as long as we think through our documentation and description. We think about any rules that we have that are impacting our ability to put things into place, and all that. So let's walk through these real quick. So security and access questions. So are you working with data that is confidential? Are you working with data that is under an IRB? So you're working with human subjects data. Are you working with, in this case, maybe our paper surveys contain student information. And if that's the case, the federal FERPA law applies. And so it means we have to put it in some kind of a secure university location, which is why we pick OneDrive, because that's our secure official university location. So these questions matter. If you're doing forest inventory and analysis data, some of that data comes from private land, and so you're not allowed to share that, and you have to understand that going into it. So think about this, and it impacts which of these you can use. Maybe Dropbox, which has had security breaches in the past, is not a place where you can put some of this stuff. So work through that a little bit. Sharing rules. So are you going to work kind of publicly, or are you going to do this all privately? Do you have team members that need access to it? If so, that's going to impact which of these options we pick as well. So again, if I assume this project is going to involve 3 other people, can I share OneDrive with them? Yeah, probably. Can I create a shared library in Zotero? Yeah, I I can do that. And GitHub, I can also share with them as well. So this works for working with a team. This works for working by myself. Either way. But then none of this is actually going to make any sense unless we document what we're doing. And so that's part of the reason why I extract metadata on these data files at the beginning. So just because you collect this data doesn't mean you remember where you got it from. Doesn't mean your team members know where you got it from. If you're collecting from an instrument and the instrument stops working for a week and there's a big gap in the data, that ought to be documented somewhere that happened. So that somebody coming along looking at that data set in your store will understand that issue happened. So there's these kinds of questions that you have to start answering right at the beginning, and then you're going to keep fleshing that out as you go. So it's good to keep your metadata and your data sets together. Does that make sense to folks? Okay. Right, so we've got our rules, we've got our location, and then we start working. We start, maybe we have some raw data that we have to clean up. Maybe we're going to start processing it. Maybe we're going to kind of run through a series of analyses, create different plots and different graphics. We're going to try different things. Maybe these are multiple drafts of a document that I'm writing. And basically, we're just going to treat this the same way we treated everything else. Anything new needs to have metadata associated with it. All the rules are going to apply to those as well. We're going to keep track of them in these storage locations as well. And that leads us to the nice, easy answer. Why we do this whole thing, which is so we can enable basically all of this to happen. So when we get to the point where, say I submit an article to a journal, and they say, well, you also have to share your data. The good news is we've prepared all of this stuff, and so now it's ready to go. Or if I get an opportunity to work with a partner, and they say, oh, this would be really great. I think we can collaborate in this way. I'm ready to go and ready to share my stuff. If my dissertation advisor wants to see stuff, it's all ready to go. So we've made this process more efficient. We've optimized it, and it works reasonably well, I think. Does that all kind of make sense to people as a model that you can kind of think through? Part of the point here is that it's pretty much technologically agnostic. So you can use any tools, technology you think is best. You can use any file system, computer, whatever, and it should generally be able to work for you in this case. We just have to make sure we think through, particularly the governance rules, on how it's going to work. So with that in mind, I kind of wanted to take a little time to let everybody sort of process how this might look for them and the kinds of work they do. I know we have an interdisciplinary group of people here from lots of different fields, and so I'd be curious to hear kind of how well it works and how well this maps to the kinds of projects you're doing. So maybe think of if you're deep in your dissertation or thesis right now, maybe think about how it maps to this. If you're just working in a group with a bunch of other folks, how well does it map with this? Maybe take out a piece of paper. Got the whiteboard there too, if you like, and maybe just kind of work on this for about 5 or 10 minutes. Does that sound okay? And the people on Zoom can do the same. Sorry, thank you guys.
on something like this for, say, a PhD dissertation, right? You have 3, 4 chapters. Each one of those is their own sort of individual project, yet they're interrelated and they're overlapping. So the attendance numbers, say, is something that would go into multiple projects. So like one of the big issues I feel like I run into is, when I'm organizing things, do I organize by type? Do I organize by project? Particularly when things overlap, so that you cut down on data duplication.
Yeah.
This looks like very much sort of a single project.
This is a single project, but if we want to think of this as almost a stream of lots of different types of data, we're going to have a folder hierarchy of maybe chapters, or maybe projects, or maybe spatial locations. So let's say you've got lots of different projects that you collect data from different places. Maybe that's the easiest way for you to keep track of it at some level, and then at a secondary level, you've got another set of project folders where the sort of derived products for each project go into. That makes sense. So I think you should, think of this as, this can be any number of things that are going to be bundled into buckets, depending on what kinds of buckets that you think are best. And I mean, that's somewhat of an individualized problem, I guess, whether or not the same data is being reused in multiple projects, or whether each data set is unique to like a chapter of your thesis. I mean, generally, I would argue for each version of the data being in one place. So maybe you have raw versions of everything, kind of organized by concept or subject or theme or something like that, or location or time. But then each time you analyze that in the context of a different project, you're putting that into a specialized chapter 2 folder, chapter 3 folder, or something like that. I think minimizing duplication is important because, for example, with your metadata, every time you duplicate the data, you're also ideally duplicating your metadata. You're just increasing the size of everything, and then you've got to keep track of where all that is. So minimizing that, to me, the best approach. Do other people have thoughts on how this applies possibly to their work? Well, theoretically, I think it could work for philosophy people or English, or as well as sciences and engineering as well. So yeah, I think it's a model to maybe consider as you go. Yeah, we're going to talk a little bit about file names, and some of you might have seen this document before. I think we've all been through this kind of experience where there's all sorts of things going on in our folders. But actually, I think in terms of file organization, you can actually see what's going on really well. So it's not a bad model for communicating through file names. So generally, and this is a little bit of what we were just talking about, thinking about file names, file naming conventions can vary, certainly from individual to individual, but it's also something that if you're working with a group of people, you all need to be on the same page about how you're going to name things, because otherwise you're going to end up all over the place. So the things to think about are those issues of how are you organizing your data. So are these organized by locations of data collection? I know climate modeling, sometimes we deal with decadal intervals, so time is a good way of organizing that. Subject, topic, or theme, something like that is always a way to think. And you might do combinations of them, right? So you're going to, for some reason, you need to kind of fold those together. Generally speaking, having your date in the file name, I know that a lot of computers will have date information associated with the file, but that changes all the time. And date also works as a pretty effective interactive versioning mechanism so that you can tell whether this is a thing that was worked on Monday or Tuesday or Wednesday and so on. This is a fairly standardized structure for dates. Year, month, date is something called ISO 8601, and that's essentially the date time format there. So it's a useful thing to pay attention to. And not every system cares about spaces, but enough systems do, particularly if you're doing command line processing of some sort, or you're dealing with GIS software. It's a good habit to just get used to putting underscores instead of spaces and not having spaces and things. Because again, it may not be a problem for you, but for your team members who are maybe doing a different part of the project, they might run into problems if they try to suck in those files into whatever analysis software they're using. So keep those kinds of things in mind. And so examples of what you might do, and this is a little bit of come up with a convention that works for what you guys want to do. But here's an example of the date in that format, location and variable information, and then kind of the differentiation between the stage of the analysis. So there's raw data, there's clean data, there's analyzed 1, analyzed 2, kind of depending on what your processes are. There could be all sorts of iterations. So does that kind of make sense?
When you're searching for a file, does this underscore help somehow, or it doesn't matter?
In the search, probably not. You're talking in terms of just being on desktop.
Like if you put the part of the title, like one word from the title, you don't remember what exactly you called the file. And
okay.
To search and find that specific file.
I think so. Like if you knew, for example, you're looking for stream temperature data, I mean, that would probably fail. I'm assuming with most PCs, that's going to fail if you search temperature. But if you put in temp, if you know you named it temp, then that should be able to pick that up. Location, that also is something I think you'd be searching for typically. And maybe raw or clean may even be something that you would, depending on the nature of the data you're dealing with, that may be something that they care about as well. And I think that's a good idea, is what might you be searching for? What kinds of things make sense for your organizational scheme?
When you start naming it,
when you start
you'll be finding it.
Yeah, come up with that convention and then stick to that convention. Yeah.
I was just going to say something that helped me using something like this is once I realized I was creating a file and I made a naming, I had like a little cheat sheet that I had. Okay. And then I did the dates. I started doing them at the end, but I like it at the front because there would be times where I knew I had a meeting where I documented notes. And on my calendar, I would go and say, oh, that was on the 9th. So then it was easy to search through all my files by just picking the date. And then that brought those files right to me. So those two have been helpful. But the cheat sheet was the big one because at the time, I thought this makes perfect sense. And I do my files all this way. And then a month later, I'm like, I know there was a method. And once I started creating a cheat sheet, it was easier. And then you can copy paste it.
It's a good idea. Yeah.
And I also put version number, version 1, version 2.
Okay.
Maybe in one day, I keep on updating my document several times. And I tend to forget everything, which one to open and see. So I learned it in a harder way, but I do that now.
Yeah, I think that's a perfectly viable way to do it. Absolutely. Yeah.
Just to comment on the date thing, if you run into problems where if you do the date and the date is not actually relevant, then when you're looking visually at the whole thing, file full of, or folder full of files, then you might have different types of files that are all separated out because then they're being organized by date and not actually being organized by the subject of the file. So if this was microcrete stream temp, those would all list out together. But let's say we had a file for some other part of the thing that had a date in between there, that would get stuck in between those two in your file structure.
When I was doing that, I found that when you get more, you're very rarely scanning the files. I'm searching. Like I know the folder to go to, and then I will copy and paste the search, and I will filter the folder for me. But me personally, I found I very rarely scan through that whole list.
Yeah. Something to be aware.
Yeah, good tips. It certainly has an impact. The more data that you have, bigger problem. Any other experiences with file names?
Just one other one. If you are listing things with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 at the beginning, computer organizes things. So you would have if you didn't do 0 1s, then you get 1 and 10. Those files are next to each other as opposed to 1, 2, 0, 5.
Yeah, fun experiences. We're going to put the slides up afterwards, and there's some, to be honest, there are so many different documents out there for thinking about file names and file naming conventions and tips for this. Those are 2, and they've got links in them to lots of other things, so those are available. Thinking about storage options a little bit, I think everybody, I hope, is aware of OneDrive as a resource that you can be using. You have upwards of a terabyte of space on OneDrive as of, I think, this year. Others that we typically might run into, I seem to have a lot of people that want to use Google Drive for everything, which is fine. But yeah, you get up to about 15 gigabytes and then you're in the pay territory. So some of you may already be there, I don't know. Dropbox, 2 gigabytes, and then OwnCloud is something that if you work on an NCAN project, you maybe are using that. It's an alternative cloud storage system. And I would generally recommend using cloud storage as much as you can. It just saves with the whole problem of backups and alternatives in other locations should something happen to your computer. One thing I wanted to point you guys to, at least as something to think about, is the Open Science Framework. Are folks familiar with this resource? Yeah.
Can you change the screen view?
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. Gotcha. Does that work? Yeah. Okay. So this is a organization that's in the business of trying to enable open science. Oh, yeah. I'm not going to remember my stuff. Well, let's just look for a public project and I'll point it out to you here. Biology. Yeah, looks like they're doing some stuff. So what's cool about this is it gives you a landing page for a project, and it's something that you can bring a bunch of collaborators into so other people can be on it. And by default, it's private, but at any point you can switch it over and make it public. One of the neat things about it is you can integrate data from lots of different storage providers. So you can integrate a OneDrive and a Google Drive and a Dropbox all in the same place right here, so that, you know, if for some reason you've got it in 3 or 4 different places, you can bring it all together and that everybody will see all of that in the same place at the same time. It's also got a wiki capability, so you can document things in that, some way of notifying team members and all that kind of stuff. So I'd recommend that you, if you're thinking about, you know, I need a way to sort of integrate a lot of this kind of stuff, take a look at OSF. You know, it's not perfect. You have some limitations about how much data you can store there. But especially if you want the project to be public in some way, you can actually, when you turn it public, you can get a DOI number associated with your project, and it becomes a link that you can share with other people saying if you want to know about what we're doing, comes with it. So the Open Science Framework is a pretty good tool for enabling open science, surprisingly.
So what's the website called?
This is osf.io. Yeah, it's worth taking a look at. Yep.
When you go to sign up for it, it asks if you want to do an institutional account. Does University of Idaho have?
We don't. To my knowledge.
Do I have to pay for it?
No, not up to. I think it's probably a premium model, at least at the smaller levels. I've got a couple of projects up there. Any other questions? Okay. It's worth taking a look at.
Does that meet, does that meet the requirements for data sharing for various kinds of journals and things?
Depends on what they're asking for. So there's a good chance that if they say, we want data to be in this set of repositories or these kinds of repositories, you're going to have to look at it pretty closely. I think it depends on the journal. It's tradition. I guess it's not really a data repository, I would say. Yeah. So if they just want you to have it shared in a public place, it would absolutely fit that expectation. If they explicitly say we want a disciplinary repository like Dryad or something like that, yeah, you'll have to get it into Dryad. So.
Not the fun, but the university does have a data repository if you need to make it open access.
That's a good point. Yes. Yeah, I didn't really think about it here, but yes, if you need to share your data, we can do that. Yeah.
Agreed.
Okay. Do you have a question? Oh, okay. Any other questions? Okay. I kind of handed out this document to you all. And like I said, we're not really going to talk about data management plans per se. In the sort of very formal sense, like writing a proposal and you have to write a plan. But generally speaking, as you launch any project, it's worth going through this sort of data management checklist and just making sure that you are thinking through these issues ahead of time, because they're not things you want to run into later. We talked about most of this. The one thing we didn't really talk about is roles and responsibilities. So especially if you're working with a group of people, with whom does the buck stop is a decent question. So who's responsible for ensuring that the files are following the naming conventions, and who's responsible for writing the metadata for the enrollment numbers that we saw? Is it the person who collected it? Is it somebody else? Making sure that those are laid out. This is really just a political conversation with your team members about who's responsible for what and making sure that we are all on the same page. So these are things you got to think about. Hopefully all of this is potentially applicable at some level to your project. There's some really specific stuff about certain types of data in there, but I think most of it's pretty general. So I kind of wanted to highlight a few issues for dealing with notes. And it's kind of when we talked about organizing your research for this workshop, it was kind of split into these two areas, right? One is this formal file and data management. The other is organizing all of this stuff that you generate while you're trying to do research. So you're reading articles, you're thinking about things, you're taking notes. Some of these tools are things that I'm sure all of you are familiar with, like Evernote and OneNote, and there's some other kinds of note-taking software that's out there. But I wanted to highlight a couple of things. One is good old-fashioned index cards, note cards, as a potential option, like these things, basically. And the main reason to think about that is when we actually physically write things by hand, it's inscribed in our memory much more effectively than when we type them on a computer. We all know this. I've seen lots of nods. And so there is a value as you're note-taking to consider doing something in physical form, because it'll actually help you retain that information a little bit better. And so at the margins, it may be key for you. There's a lot of different kinds of ways to think about organizing cards. I'm not going to get into all of them other than to say, essentially you can do citation management. You can pull out direct quotes that really kind of stuck with you. You can just summarize ideas on cards, like this book was about this article was about this. Get that kind of written down. But if you're really convinced that digital approaches are the best way, there are software to make that easier. This Zettelkasten method, have you guys run into that before? It's there's some people in Germany who are really serious about this as the way to go. And it's very note card oriented, and it's pretty Mac oriented too. So it's a lot of the software they point to is really primarily for Mac users. I'm not a Mac user, so it doesn't really apply. But they've got a ton of information about the way this method might work and how it enhances your productivity and all this kind of stuff. So it's on here. If you want to take a look at it, it might be for you. I want to put that out there. This other link is to a gentleman who's a scholar in institutional governance, and he's written rather extensively about his process for note-taking and keeping track of these ideas, synthesis matrices and spreadsheets and other kinds of ways of tracking. So again, take a look at these, and I think you guys will all be able to access the slides later, so you should have those links. There's a couple of other tools to think about here about annotating documents. So, I mean, it's nice to write things out, but it's also sometimes easier when you've got a huge library of PDFs that you're working through to be able to run through something that has an annotating kind of functionality associated with it. So at least two options for that. Mendeley, if you use that piece of software, has a built-in annotator that tracks kind of what you're using. So that's your citation manager. You've also got your annotator in there as well. And it's a nice resource for helping you to kind of keep track of all your notes. Hypothesis, do folks use Hypothesis at all? Yeah, a little bit, okay. Yeah, it's a browser extension. And if you open up your documents in your browser, you've got basically a cloud-based annotator. So as you kind of mark up a document and keep notes, these things will be saved into this cloud system, and you can kind of get back to those notes whenever you want. So it's an interesting and cool way of annotating lots and lots of documents. So yeah, I think generally speaking, whether you're sort of trying to keep track of the literature that you're collecting or you're trying to keep track of the notes, it's really just the basic idea of what works for you. And all these different tools do different things. So try them out and see if you can find a couple that really work with them. Any questions about any of that?
Yeah, I have a weird question, not directly related to this.
Okay.
But is there any website or software that can rephrase or paraphrase or annotate for me?
Annotate for you?
Yeah, I mean, paraphrasing and rephrasing, it's always challenging for people like me whose first language is not English. And if I get that kind of help.
So it takes a chunk of the document and kind of summarizes what's in the document. What's that? Grammarly?
Yeah, I use Grammarly for many of my students, but that's actually a bit basic. Okay. I always use the free one.
And I searched this kind of every website. It's very easy to search for everything.
Yeah, I have seen several of those, but none of them are actually very scholarly or anything standard. So, I mean, I don't know. I thought I should ask it today.
Yeah, that's to be honest, that's not an area I've looked at very closely before. So I'll ask around. Let's see what we can come up with. Yeah. Any other questions? Or does anybody have a really good system, or how they kind of manage literature and notes and all that?
Yes, I do.
You do? Okay.
Yes. My advisor is he wants me to do it, and in my master's as well in my country, that advisor also always pushed me to use section managers. So I used Mendeley in my MA in 2014. Now I use Annotating.
Cool. Yeah, it's. I think with all of these tools, it's a problem of sort of learning to get used to using them for what you do and disciplining yourself to do that. But once you get into it, saves you time, saves you energy, makes life a little easier. Yeah.
What's the difference between Mendeley and Solterra?
Good question. There's a range of differences. The interfaces are certainly very different, but they're both applications that you can download. So they're standalone applications. They both have browser extensions, web servers. I'd say Mendeley has a lot more built-in tools like this annotation functionality. And probably the biggest thing is they tie your library and the library of everybody else that uses Mendeley into a large database that you can then use to find references that other people have. found and added to their libraries. So Zotero is still working on that functionality, I think. It's not as fleshed out as what Mendeley does. There's some other kind of importing mechanisms that are a little different. Mendeley has a really clean drag and drop, kind of drag a PDF right in and it reads, most of the time, it reads the document. Depends on the metadata that's embedded in that PDF, but it works pretty well. Zotero is still getting there. So
there was a training on Zotero. Will there be a training on Mendeley?
I don't know, actually. Yeah, it's something that I've used quite a bit. So if you, want to get into it, we can.
I only ask because I also just speak for myself, made the assumption that where Zotero was promoted and was training on it, that was maybe the preferred, the better.
So I think maybe the issue there is Zotero is an open source project provided by, I think, a group at George Mason University. Mendeley is owned by the publishing company Elsevier, and people have issues with Elsevier. And so there's also the questions about data mining and things like that, which, it's up to each of us to figure out where we stand on that. But I think that's probably why.
So it's more of a preference, not necessarily functionality.
I wouldn't argue that it's a functionality difference personally.
So will there be any more workshops on Citation Manager?
I don't know.
Yeah, I missed one. It was clashing with my office hours. So.
Oh, okay.
We do have, there aren't any upcoming workshops scheduled for Mendeley or for EndNote, but there is a, Justin Martinez, who taught the initial Zotero workshop, is going to be teaching a second one on one of our workshop calendar on October 10th at 2:30. And that one, we had some technical issues with the recording of the Zotero workshop for this section, but that one's going to be recorded and made available online too. Okay. So October 10th at 2:30 in this room.
Thank you.
Will that be the same as the last one?
Yes.
So just sort of an underlying citation question. Papers. In terms of storing the files, so I use Mendeley and I usually download the papers. And so I have waffled between having a single folder where all PDFs are dumped into, and with whatever arbitrary naming comes when you download them.
Yep.
Or whether you actually try to spend some time renaming those things, or whether you farm it out to different project folders and have paper folders within those that you then have the citation manager keep track of. I'm just curious if you have any thoughts or advice about best practices there.
Yeah, I think for me, I have a massive PDF library. There's no way I'm going to go through and change those titles. I'm really relying at this point on the citation manager to tell me what those are. That's probably not. I think it goes back to what I was saying about the sort of minimum number of places to store things in a maximally useful way. And the citation manager is going to be, we can organize those references by folders that can map to our folders in our data source. So we have chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3, and we have all of our data files there. We can also have chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3 in our Mendeley structure with the references there. So that's the way I think about it. It's the way I do it.
But the underlying architecture you don't organize at all.
Try not to. Yeah.
Because the one problem I have run into with Mendeley is with that search function that you were talking about, and searching the sort of the crowdsourcing the citations, is I have run into those citations not actually being accurate.
Yeah. Oh yeah. That's very common.
And so you end up doing a fair amount of your own cleaning and work.
Yeah, that's rampant in all scholarship citations being incorrect.
So, is there any plan from library in the future to have any workshop on latex?
Yes, I believe there is.
Yes.
Great.
Let me get you the date for that workshop. That's coming up. So our latex workshop is scheduled for Wednesday, October 30th
I have seen my professor from computer science. It's like a magic. He gives everything comes out. You don't need to do anything about any citation. Everything is done for you. And I have been dreaming for the last 3 years when I can learn it and apply it for my own dissertation. That would be really helpful.
Yep. All right, any other comments or questions? I was asked to put this slide in, but I think we're actually at the last one, so it doesn't really matter. Okay. And there's some references to some of the stuff that I pointed out, and there's also really good resources if you follow those as well. So, believe it or not, that's what I had for you guys. Not a ton of information, but dense information, I think, to use. And so, I think I'm open to any other questions or comments. If there's anything from chat that came through from Zoom, I guess, I'm happy to answer.
Is it possible to do like
Yeah, pretty much all the EndNotes, Mendeley's up there, they all have group functionality. All right, well, if there's nothing else, thanks for coming, guys. I appreciate it.
If you want a short assessment that Jeremy's going to pass out up there,